Time to start the day.
All right, here we are. It's Friday. My favorite time of the week and of Friday is API storytelling time, and I definitely could use some good storytelling this week. Mike isn't with us, but let me get Aiden in here. What's up,
Hey,
sir?
Ken.
How are you today?
I'm doing well. Part of me wants to just do like a Mike Amundsen impression, just like to bring some of that energy back.
Oh man, I would like to see that. I haven't even ever thought about doing one. That I'd have to study more videos of Mike, but yeah.
I think my favorite Mike is when he has a good idea, but someone else is talking. He goes, like you can see it. You can see the light
Yes,
bulb go off.
yeah, and then he'll start like searching through the attic. You'll see his eyes go up into his head a little bit. He's like looking up, and it goes back and forth a little bit, and he's like searching through all the. I'm imagining a big massive mainframe brain type thing that he has to like index and go through to find. All right, I'm going to respond in this way. I'm going to do this.
I almost want to see the wall behind because I'm sure it's like one of those big like Ouija board things with the arrows everywhere connecting things together.
Yeah.
We love Mike so we can joke, but
well, I just know he's got an arsenal of ideas and thoughts that he has and he cultivates that don't always get published or out there, and he's constantly moving them forward. And so like I think someday we should just do a show that's just like, let's explore your whole catalog, your whole everything that you've been working through, like work through all, any of these ideas that haven't seen the light of day. Like let's shine a light on them. Tell us about them.
mm-hmm. Now that you mention it, I almost feel like Mike is trying to be a living hypermedia machine because I feel like he always has like those tangents that you wouldn't expect to get us to really interesting spots. So maybe this is all an act to prove the value of hypermedia, and at the end,
Yeah.
he'll reveal it as what it was, like some magic show.
I could see that. He's like, I mean, the old roots of hypermedia that, like it as a living organism that it like puts out roots and it has all these different paths it can follow. Some of them stay alive, some of them 404, after a while, some of them 301. But he's got this like massive network of hypermedia ideas and thoughts and visions I think he works from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we were doing some product design this week, and we tried to basically model some user experiences as if they were a hypermedia API, which was
Mm-hmm.
not a way of designing products I've ever done before. I've always like started with user stories or drawings and tried to connect things with arrows. But thinking about the user's journey as a hypermedia API, which is like only something people building API tools would think is like, oh, let's try this time. It actually revealed a lot of interesting affordances that we weren't expecting. So it changed the design, trying to design it that way. So that made me like appreciate mental models a whole lot more. But it made us smarter. Like just thinking about the world as all these connections made us smarter, which I think is pretty cool. That all you have to do is just like try to fit yourself into this different framing, and all of a sudden you come up with different ideas.
So that's I would say a good placeholder for what we were deciding about what to talk about. And we had two on the table. One we're going to put aside for when Mike gets here. But what you just described is like, so I still have it up. I'll have to find it sometime, but it's called API Journey. And it was a subway map, city transit inspired, but hypermedia driven client side tool. So it used Siren, which my good friend Kevin Swiber created. They created which is my favorite version of hypermedia. There's How, there's several others, but I went with Siren. And in the interface, you could start with a dot. So think transit map. And I was wanting people, it was early API lifecycle conversation. So you see where I'm going. I'm going to steer away. We're sidelining the transit and city one, but I want to talk about API lifecycle today. But it was a transit map, client-side transit map tool that was hypermedia driven, that you started with a round dot of where you are. And then you would go, where do you want to go? What's your life cycle? What do you do next? And you would type in, and it would add the Siren hypermedia link, and then it would create a new page for your next link. And then you would go there, and that would be the next stop. And so now you had a red line with another dot on it. And then you would type in and fill at what this stop. And then, okay, well, what's next? And you would go to what's next. And then you go, well, now we need to go back to the documentation. So you draw a line. And so it was very much a hypermedia way of defining the API lifecycle, but using a transit map. So with that, we're going to talk about API lifecycle today.
And that's also a great preview for an episode where we talk about city planning and how it intersects with APIs, as others would.
Yeah, in the future, stay tuned. We're going to wait till Mike gets back, but that's going to be a good one. So sidelining that and staying focused on the API lifecycle. I know you and I talked about it the week before we had Z on, but it's such a relevant and ongoing, and it's something I feel like we have to, like, my week's been spent battling about how do we define it and why. I wouldn't say just like what it is, but why we need to get on the same page and why it's such a problem that we can't all communicate about what is the API lifecycle in a meaningful way that benefits us all. And you all, Optic, Dev, everybody has, you've been publishing some great stuff on this. So I wanted to focus on that side of it, because you all have a very good view of, I would say, very realistic, pragmatic view of what the API lifecycle is based upon the life we live on a day-to-day basis, that I think is a more honest, true representation of what the API lifecycle is, rather than the hand-wavy, often design first that we want to exist but never fully exists. So walk me through the blog post that I'm talking about.
Yeah, definitely. First thing I'll say is, I think it's great that there's all of these different ideas for where we want to get to, like design first, and all these different things that people have been testing and trying out for a long time. But our bend has always been like, how do we take what is already there, the reality of the situation and the life that developers are living, and try to fit into that actual workflow? Because, to do design first right, to actually, participate in that, everybody has to write down their changes before they make them. And they have to write them down in something like OpenAPI or a JSON schema or something like that. And that's fine if one person is doing it. But as soon as you get into these, real world working on something, some of them are new employees, some of them have been there for a long time, some of them are just there, for a year on their way to the next job they're going to get. So there's just these realities of like human nature. Like, we're not going to write down our changes, and we're definitely not going to plan everything that we do. But sometimes we want to at least talk about the things that we did, and sometimes we do want to plan what we do. And I think the fact that we have to sort of choose one or the other, code first or design first, has always to me felt like something that is indicative of a poorly understood life cycle. Like, the fact that we even have to choose tells us that we don't necessarily have the right abstraction.
Yeah. That's I think the people part that you just described, like the realities of the incentive models for people to participate, to not participate, to talk past each other, talk over each other, yell at each other, not care. Like, people, I'm out of this job, I'm moving on, or I'm here temporarily, like, to the point. And then the people who really care, and maybe even care too much and shouldn't care so much, like I get in that a lot, where I'm like, no, we gotta like focus on this design, and like other people are like, chill, man, relax, like,
yeah,
like this, like you're focusing too much on the open API and the details, and like let's talk about the use cases and and so I don't think we think about these and talk about these human layers too much when it comes to the life cycle. And so what Optic does is still very open API centered, but it's not by choice. It's based upon and correct me if I'm wrong, the current kind of view in the space about how you do this, a lot of people, me included, feel that you center around open API. It's the kind of anchoring vocabulary that's going to get us on the same page. But I'm regularly, like I was just on a call with a big financial company I won't mention, but they're like, we're still on Swagger and we don't have any intention to go to Open API 3. And I'm like, okay, yeah. All right. And then there was like a couple people on the call, like, I just don't care about Swagger, like, or Open API, And so, like, how do we bridge those realities? Is there other ways that we can bring people together and find alignment and get us talking that's not Open API or Swagger or collection driven, and come up with other ways?
Yeah. So we have part of this, like, I can say it officially now, but in a couple of weeks, Optic is going to look very different than it looks now. We're in the middle of a big remix of the product around some of these new ideas we've been publishing. And when we went to like go look at kind of all the hundreds of interviews we've done with different people, a few really kind of stood out to us this time that didn't really stand out to us before. And it was, we sorted everyone by like who was using OpenAPI in the past, who had used OpenAPI and had failed, who was using OpenAPI and was successful, and then who were using other tools to have the same kinds of conversations. And some of those alternatives, you won't be surprised, are things like Postman. So seeing, that my Postman collection has changed, and then talking about it on Slack or in GitHub or inside of Postman was like a very common way people do this change management and get alignment around what they're building. But we were also super surprised. We just sort of like ignoring, but we realized like a pretty significant percentage of people we had talked to were using things like Google Drive and like pasting examples in, or sending each other Slack messages saying, here's what I'm thinking. It's an example of the endpoint's response that I'm going to give you. And someone would write back, oh, well, can you make this field do this? And can you make this paginated? And you can do it. Oh, sure. Yeah, here you go. And then like, oh, I changed one thing between talking about it with you on Slack and actually going to build it. Here's that one change that you need to know about. And that's how, most of the APIs are internal and partner. I think public APIs are their own problem set that we're not particularly interested in at Optic, but all these internal partner APIs, like that's how these are being built today. It's not Open API. And by and large, people aren't really using that tool. And we've had companies come in that were using like RAML and Swagger 2 and Open API in the same project, like different people on the same team. But the important thing was they were having conversations about it. And that's really what Optic has focused on. And in these blog posts, which I can screen share in a sec, like we really want to create a conversation about the API and how it's changing, because that's what matters. APIs are people doing things for each other. So that was an interesting thing we saw again when we looked back at our data. And the other thing we realized is we put Optic into like production for a couple people over the last few months. And as soon as we did that, they were like, well, we want to know about this before it happened. Like we want to talk about this change, like in the pull request during design really early. We weren't super surprised by that, but it was super interesting how people, once they knew all of their life cycle and all of the things that were breaking for them, were like, oh, we need process, we need design first now. We need something that's going to help us talk about changes before they happen. So that was kind of all the context. Like we're a tool that looks at your traffic. It's sort of like Git. It'll help you diff traffic when your API changes, and then create this field showed up in my API. I want to add it to the spec. And we make that spec editing really easy for people. But all the lifecycle stuff, all the workflow stuff, we've always known we'd have to tackle. And this is sort of our thesis about how to do that based on some of the learnings we have from working with real environments, from working with teams that don't really use Open API today, and trying to understand what could actually work. So that's kind of the context, and I'll hop into sort of what we came to as our prototype. But that's kind of where we're seeing the world from, like those kinds of people who have tried all these tools before and are kind of doing it themselves.
Yeah, that's what I'm really interested in. Just extract one nugget out of what you said before you continue on is, so you said organizations realize you need to go API design first so that we can talk about change before it happens. So I think that's important. Sorry, there's a fly in my face. Because it's actually not about API design.
No.
And that always dominates the conversation, and in my opinion derails the conversation and excludes a lot of people from the conversation, because if you're not API literate and you don't know about API design, you're not open API literate and know how to apply API design using open API, you're excluded from those conversations. And I think that statement gets at a lot of the root of what you're talking about. So anyways, continue, dive into the post. I'd love to hear how you guys are approaching it.
Yeah. So real quick on that note, I think in our first episode we ever did with Mike Cabay, like we talked about how OpenAPI and some design processes like don't bring all the stakeholders in. It's sort of exclusive. Like it's like, this is the language we speak, the wizards, but you don't know how this language works. Like it's like derivatives on Wall Street. Like what is a derivative? Like what is the mortgage-backed security? Like, you know, it's just designed to make our eyes glaze over. And I think Mike Amundsen, other Mike, has also talked a lot about in his design work he does with teams. They don't start with OpenAPI. They start with like, you know, requirements, user stories, and example requests. And then like the API, OpenAPI is the last thing that people craft. So I think that's just an interesting kind of observation I've heard from a lot of people who are in the design space. Even like, it's not even a secret. It's not like a new idea. It's just like, that's how people start. And OpenAPI always comes later.
Yeah, no, I like it.
So I'm gonna hop in on two different places, one post and one thing in Notion. Let's see if I can actually share my screen here. Oh no, it's asking for my password. This is never a good sign. Okay, I'm gonna have to disappear, and I'll be back in 1 second.
I'll hold down the fort.
Okay, I hope you can handle this.
I'll just talk to myself. So why this is important, like the API lifecycle piece is super fascinating, because like, how do we make it more inclusive so that people can get in here and understand what's happening? And I think what Aiden's touching on is very much that inclusive piece. Hello, I was just talking to people, so welcome back.
Keep going. It sounded good. I only got the last bit, but it sounded good.
No, it's just about making the life cycle more inclusive. And part of that is being able to see it and talk about it, and not just make it a hand wavy thing that only us wizards know about. It's not, I don't want the API lifecycle to be, you know, sermons in Latin that only, you know, so I want us to have a common vocabulary, common language that everyone, business users as well, not just technical, can understand what we're talking about when we're talking about design first, code first, document testing, deprecation, all these things, that it's not wizard lingo. So anyways.
Yeah. So I'm going to start with a question, and then I'm going to share my screen. And it's a question that I think all developers can also be thinking about as I ask you. What is the most common kind of version control out there today that every developer uses?
What is the most common version control? So, I mean, Git.
Yeah. So we're all familiar with using Git and having conversations and pull requests. That's how we're doing this today for our code. So what's the first step in Git with your team?
Say it again. You skipped a little bit.
What's the first step in using Git with your team to talk about a change together?
Talk about a change? I mean, you got to have a repo, a place for the source control to exist, so you can make that change. I mean, that would be the first. But if we're going to make that change, I mean, it's a conversation on a pull request. I don't know.
And how does the pull request get opened? What did you do to, you know, change the masthead on our website from green to blue? What did you have to do first?
Fork.
Okay, you're going all the way to the beginning. So you have it forked. It's on your machine. Your IDE is open. You've decided we're going to change the color, and you're going to make a really big rant in that pull request message about why we should. But what do you have to do before you can open that pull request?
Make a change.
Make a change. Yep. And then what's the most important part? You have to do something with that change so that Git knows about it.
Have to commit it.
Yeah. So what is committing? Like what is that? If we like take away the Git context, like what does it actually mean?
Well, it's that what they did when they put me in that one mental institution. No, I mean, it's you have intent. You're committing to something in you have the intent to change something and do that with other people in a collaborative way, acknowledging that there's other people involved in that. Is that where you're getting at?
Yeah. So we think of this as writing down the change. And this is the thing that plagues a lot of design first workflows. It's really hard to get developers to write down the change. And we don't really care whether they write the change down after they change the code or before they change the code. Mm-hmm. That's the bike sheddy pedantic part of it. But we need people to write down the change. We need people to say, here's what I changed, so that it can be a part of that. And with Git, you just change your code and then you do git add, and you've added that file to commit that then you can talk about. With API specs, you have to have a way of sharing that change too. And that's kind of the first thing that our new workflow at Optic is helping people do. So I'll pop this open for a second. Here's the share button. Cool. So when you go into the new Optic, you'll be able to click a bunch of different options for how you want Optic to be able to learn about your API. So that might be observing some traffic from your local environment. That might be by importing a snippet of OpenAPI. That might be intercepting some traffic by looking at your staging environment or or production. It might be by pulling in your Postman collection and seeing the last time you ran it. It might be test. It might be pulling traffic from the real environment. But when you go to actually make a change, Optic is going to help you basically record that change so you can share it with your team. So you'll pick an option that works for you. You can click add endpoint or update. Yeah. Here we go. Is that better?
Yeah, that's better.
Yep. So you can say like add endpoint or update endpoint. Inside of Optic, you're clicking around saying what your intent is and actually committing to some of these changes to your API. So you can say, I want to add an endpoint. You'll be able to collect that traffic from local, test, Postman, all those different options. And then what it does is as it collects that traffic, it'll be, oops, that doesn't get very big. It'll basically document an endpoint if that's what you're trying to do and let you add that to your spec. And if you are changing an existing endpoint, you can either change it manually by editing the schema or use some traffic from your machine again to patch the specification. So this is almost like doing a Git diff, but it's doing an API diff. And when you make these changes, it'll just look at traffic from Postman or wherever and say, hey, like based on this new traffic, this new way the API is working, here's all the things that we're seeing and changing. Does this look right? And do you want to patch your spec with these changes? And basically, this is all designed around getting the time to record a change down from, a couple of minutes to go write an OpenAPI patch by hand. That also requires a lot of knowledge and a lot of manual work to something you can do in a minute or two. So every developer can just click a button, make a change, show their work to their team, and have all of that done in a minute or two without having to know how OpenAPI works.
And so I get if you're doing this locally or mocking it, but if this is a development or production, what does that back end look like? They've got to push that code first before they make the change, or is there some softening of that blow when it comes to actually hitting the back end?
So that's a really good question. It's something that we struggled with for a long time, trying to think about how to use a tool like Optic that learns from traffic and actually fit it into a real developer's workflow is a really hard problem to solve. So what we actually ended up thinking about is like, can we drop that rope? Can we drop environments? How would we make this so it doesn't matter? Any of these questions. And sort of the next part I was going to share is how we've come to do that. But this is sort of step one, is being able to write down your changes in a minute or two.
Yeah, no, and sorry to jump ahead there. So, I mean, I like this because it takes into consideration, is this something entirely new, a new API, or is this a change to an existing API? I just want to see the thing that I want to have happen. I want a new address field. I want a new phone number in there. I want the thing that's going to make the difference, whatever the business implementation that I'm doing. And decoupling that, I think, from all the software development lifecycle, or not, I wouldn't say decoupling. I'll wait to see what you say, but I think simplifying how we can think about change and it not being so massive of an undertaking is huge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think when we broke this down, it's really, there's a couple behaviors that you need to get right on a team. And this is something we've heard a lot from people who tried to adopt OpenAPI and failed. If it's not easy for all the developers on a 10-person team to write down their changes, like none of the other processes, none of the governance tools, none of the linters, none of the testing tools you have will actually make a difference, because they all depend on the spec being accurate. So that behavior of getting people to be able to write down their changes is so important to making the whole system work.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's the critical nature of the OpenAPI to the entire life cycle, not just saying, oh, the docs are up to date, or your OpenAPI is out of date. It's everything along that life cycle, your code gen, your tests, all of that stuff, have that property and characteristic, but allowing people to focus on that property or characteristic or the change and what needs to happen. And then, yeah, I had another thought and I lost it as I was thinking about that. So,
yeah. So let's move down here, because this is sort of the big inversion that kind of changed how we see the whole space. And this is what a lot of the articles Steve and I have been writing really focused on. So today we know what API specifications are. Like, we talk about them a lot on this show. And the idea of a specification is that it's going to show you API works today. People use it as documentation, as design artifacts to test their APIs. We know all of this. What's sort of different about the Optic specification is that it also understands every single version of the API that's ever existed. So you can think of it sort of like Git, like we have a full history of every single commit that's ever been made to this specification, and we can look with really fine-grained detail what changes were made when and by who. That StoryCorps kind of idea we've talked about before. So when you have a specification like this, it changes how you would think about the rest of the API lifecycle. And we've had this for over a year, and it wasn't obvious how it changed everything until like a couple weeks ago, but it changes everything. So let's, first of all, do you have any questions about sort of the history part before I move into sort of how it fits into other pieces?
No, dive.
Cool. So let's say we have 3 versions of an API endpoint. There's version 1, which was the first version we built. There's sort of the second revision of that endpoint where maybe there's a couple of new fields. And there's a third revision where maybe we deleted one of those fields. So in an Optic specification, we basically have sort of that first version where it's properties A, B, and C. The second version where it's A, B, C, D, and E, and then third one where it's A, B, C, D. These are like fields potentially in the response. So a lot of people talk about environments. We think about like, oh, well, what environment is this API running in? Or when I try to fit this into the software development lifecycle, it's like, okay, we have to somehow in our API specification know which environment this is running in, or we have to have different versions of our API specification for each of our environments. There's always this kind of weird inverted problem where you don't know at any one time what version of your specification is actually reality. So people who do design first really well have this other set of problems that they talk to us about, which is we have 5 changes in our spec which haven't been built yet. So our real documentation is wrong because there's not a way to versions of this document at the same time. So there's always this problem, whether you're design first or whether you're generating your spec, where it never really tells you what changes in any one environment. Are you tracking?
Yeah, no, it's again a focus on change and not the classic things us technologists focus on, and the code, and then the move to design first is just being able to see and focus on what changes and what hasn't changed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let's say that in this first version of the API where we have fields A, B, and C, this was just learned by Optic because your API wasn't documented before. You adopted Optic, we documented the whole API for you, and now this is sort of your baseline version of the API where the fields are A, B, C. Let's say that someone on the team made a code first change to add these 2 new fields, D and E. And then it was a couple weeks later that we did a design first change to remove E because we wanted our consumers to know about this. We wanted to talk about it more first. It was a bigger kind of change. So we, for whatever reason, put this through a design first process. We think all of these are basically the same. And when you have to separate code first from design first, things get super complicated. But you can imagine this idea of evidence, which is collecting real traffic that verifies certain versions work in different environments in a certain way. So this evidence is really that link between your specification and the reality. So if in production, we see this version of the specification, A, B, C, and D, then we just say version 3 is in production. If we see in production A, B, C, D, E, well, then we say version 2 is in production, or version 2 is in staging, or whatever it might be. So instead of trying to, in the spec, know what everything is at any given time, you can use real traffic in reality to actually tell you what version of your spec is currently compatible with what is in these real environments. And because of that, you can actually map in our system any sort of design first change that gets approved. You can go look at what PR it was implemented in. You can see when it appears in staging, and you can see when it appears in production. And you can do this for any set of changes for any endpoint. And it doesn't require the user to go tag anything as this is staging or this is production, or to have separate specs. It's just, instead of trying to say as a human, here's where things are running, it's actually saying, here's all the versions that could be running. Let's go see which ones are running in what places. And that inversion kind of changed the entire Optic process and what we could put out there for users. Does that make sense? These are a lot of big ideas. We're still sort of testing how to explain them to people.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's reality-based version, definition. So it's not because I put incremented .1 to .2 in the open API spec or the Git, that doesn't define the version. It's actually what's actually in there being used. Now, does this allow for gating of, because with the last design change that went through a design review and we removed E and we submitted, but now that's a breaking change. And so is that going to let that into production and just say, yeah, this is now the next version, but it's a breaking change? Is there any gates to control that, or is that up to the team to decide that?
Yep. So basically, we have three things written here. There's specs, which are these new kinds of history aware specs, which allow evidence to work in this sort of reality based way. I really love that framing that you just threw out there. Um, but the sort of middle piece that we didn't talk about yet are proposals, which are sort of what we think of as the API pull request. So we've established that using Optic can help you write down your changes really easily, whether your team knows OpenAPI or not. And now there's this new layer, which are these proposals, which allow you to basically start discussing these changes, these work in progress changes, before they actually get made and approved. And you can set up gates in CI. You can, know to pull back a production release if a change that was proposed but not approved were to be deployed. There's a lot of things you can sort of set up in your workflow. But the thing that really kind of makes us really confident that this is an interesting new way to think about the life cycle is that code first and design first both fit into proposals. When you open a change, any change in Optic, it's going to go through a proposal. And when it goes through that proposal, if it's a code first change, you have evidence alongside the proposal. You say, here are the changes I'm trying to make. Here's evidence that I've made them in this PR right here, because that's where I collected this traffic from. And if you guys approve it, then, then in the PR with our Git bot, if you approve the changes, then this Git bot will allow you to merge that code in. If you say, go make some changes to this, or this doesn't pass our, design guides or linting rules, or to break a consumer we care about, you can request changes and then go get a person to make those changes. So this will fit in for code first things right inside of your Git workflow and basically make sure that things are approved before they get released. If you're in a design first workflow, it kind of works the other way. You can open up a design first change using proposals and say, here's what I'd like to build. And then you find out when someone actually implemented this. So after it gets approved, where is the pull request where it got implemented? When does it go to staging? You can notify a consumer when it finally makes it to production. But all of this sort of goes through that same, collect the change or describe the change, propose the change, get the change approved, and then collect evidence. And that's all automatic of where those changes are across all of your sort of API lifecycle, when it's in production, when it's being tested in staging, when it's been implemented but not released. You can now see this all in your dashboard, kind of where these changes are across your system.
Yeah, and that evidence, so evidence-based has environment context. So whether that evidence is derived from a development or a staging or production, that context can be factored into the life cycle and the weightiness of a proposal, or the maturity of a proposal, like whether it's, hey, we're just proposing this at design time. It's a design, the evidence is design based. We put examples in the open API, or this evidence is production based. And so that weightiness of that proposal, or based upon, or the weight of the proposal based upon the weight of the evidence. And I didn't say that right. I'll have to work on a better one, but determines whether you could automate or it needs to be escalated and have more reviews or alerts and bring people into that conversation. But you could potentially automate non-breaking changes all the way from design to production, or code first to production, without many gates, because it's not a breaking change, because there's evidence that it's being used and works and all of that, and it's got, that makes a lot of sense.
And like you said, you can write a proposal, checks for a proposal, so you can sort of put your governance rules right there as sort of forwards only rules. So whatever is in that proposal will be checked against some rules that you have, and you can say, oh, no breaking changes. Cool, that's a good rule to have. But maybe it's no breaking changes to endpoints that have been seen in production. Maybe, when something is still in this fragile state, it's allowed to be interacted with. Or maybe internal endpoints can have a tag where you want to treat them differently than something else. Like, that's really not for Optic to decide. That's for people who are using the tool to decide. But we want to give people this really nice workflow to figure out what they want to be able to control in these systems as they evolve. And some other cool properties that kind of fall out of this is you start to understand how you can build like environment specific documentation. So maybe you want to generate a version of your API spec, your open API for a code generator or for testing or something else that only shows you what's currently in production and has tags public or partner. Or maybe you only want to show what's in staging, or maybe you want to get notifications via some webhook that'll send to people when something they've subscribed to goes from staging to production. So when you understand all these points of change, like there's this whole event-driven API you can build that really can help people extend this API workflow beyond sort of what it's responsible for to all these other parts of their organization, like communication internally, and all these other things that are going to be really important.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I like that. That's it fits with the lifecycle research I've been doing right now as far as the critical dimensions of how someone views the API lifecycle. I've kind of distilled down into, versioning and semantic versioning and the concept of current and previous and next. That's an important kind of wayfinding, like where are we at in the life cycle? What does life cycle mean? But the other dimensions was the environment. So development, staging, production, maturity, which is, so this is just design. This is an active API. This is like, what is the maturity of this? And then the other was visibility, which is this a team only? Is it an internal? Is it a partner? Is it a public? Because that describes the blast radius and severity of those types of changes. So within that environment, development, staging, production, maturity, how far along, and then that visibility, you end up with different kind of decision making that you want to make around what's allowed when it comes to change, or what's acceptable when it comes to change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think basically when you only have the open API document and it's changing, the kinds of rules you can write in something like Spectral are very limited. And when we were doing some of our research around what kind of rules people want to support, they always include when it affects a user or if it's in production, and like those kinds of qualifiers for the rules that they care about. And it just seems really interesting that like none of the tools for doing governance today really even know where things are deployed and what versions are available. And if we want to send a notification to a consumer we care about, like, do we send it when we approve the merge request for an open API change, or only when it gets to production? Like, there's all of these kinds of layers of tooling. And really what we want to do at Optic is finally make an API lifecycle that everyone can get behind, and then just have an API around it. So all the other tools can do really interesting things with the data we have. Like, I don't know exactly what Postman would do with knowing that these 3 endpoints went from staging to production, but you can definitely do something really interesting there. And so can companies like README and SDK generators could maybe auto-publish new versions of the SDKs for customers as soon as the API changes in these environments. So I think this is sort of the promise of tools like this, when we don't just have a spec, which is a flat file, but it actually is a file that understands all of the changes we've ever made, all the changes we might be making, and can tell us where those changes are across our whole life cycle. That's really what we need to change our thinking around. It's not so much trying to build tools that fit the life cycle. It's trying to build the process we care about, and then look at the life cycle of software development and understand how our APIs are evolving across that. And that's really what this is all about, is, inverting this control model to looking what's there and deciding what we want, and then knowing how they compare.
Yeah. And I'm thinking about like, so how does this feed into velocity and what you talked about a couple episodes ago? I can't remember how many, but about routes, and routes being journey based in that. So if I'm equipped with being able to just make changes as you see fit, produce the evidence, and then have the tooling and services evaluate that evidence and that proposal in real time, being context aware of the environment. This is just in staging, or this is just in development, or this is in production, visibility, and the maturity, and it just allows for the tooling and services to automate a lot more of the decision making process. But then you touched on the governance pieces, like our linting and governance is very static. I mean, the specky and spectral rules being like, oh, every parameter should have a description. But to employ that in production is just like crazy. Like, why would you all of a sudden just throw up that gate into production and require everything up till now to all of a sudden, like, we got to fix this? So having that context aware, that route and journey based aware rules to apply to a linting, so it knew where it was at in the life cycle, is pretty critical for that velocity.
Yeah, we call it like forwards only governance is what we've been saying to big companies who are interested in it. And that resonates with API excellence teams a lot, because they have seen this problem where they like write the PDF of how things should be done, but they don't anticipate the journey of getting from A to B. And yeah, if every company went and applied their API guidelines that they wrote to all their current APIs, they wouldn't be doing anything else for 6 months, because they would break every single relationship they have with their partners, every single relationship they have internally. It's just not realistic. But yeah, since our tools don't understand the life cycle, we end up, with the only real like spectral tools that I know people use are like, did it have a description? Was it camel case? Like very, very important kind of things but it's really table stakes. Like there's no rule about how pagination should work, and there's no rule about how changes are allowed to be made. Like, the removal of a field is more important than the addition of a field, like, because they're about the current spec, not about the spec and how the spec was right before that. So there's 3 or 4 different dimensions that aren't part of our rule sets today. But when you ask people, what do you want to govern? It's all that stuff, but there's no tool for writing that right now. So I think this is why, like, I kind of feel like I beat the dead horse of OpenAPI a little too much. But like, it's just not possible with it. Like I want Optic will always export OpenAPI, which you can throw into all these other tools, but like, it's just not possible to do most of the use cases people want to do with one file that humans edit. It's just not going to work. So that's where I always struggle, because it's like, I want to be open source and I want to connect to the tools in the community, but I know that the things people really care about aren't going to be served by going deeper down that road. So it's always like a conflict I feel internally with a project. And we find plenty of people who don't care, but I feel like I always feel a little like up abreast against the community sometimes.
So it's not possible with OpenAPI, but it has to be something that humans aren't totally involved in and own the entire process. So it's got to be machine readable, like this definition of the life cycle and characteristics of the API. So why would you say is the view that, well, it's not possible with OpenAPI, when OpenAPI is just structured data? Granted, what's sanctioned as OpenAPI is 15 known objects that are fairly versatile, but you can extend it any way you want, and you can define anything you want with it. So I guess I struggle at what's the OpenAPI bottleneck there in getting us there, if you can define anything you want using for an instance of the API, or for the overall life cycle, or for the governance of an API.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it comes down to like kind of the motivation behind some of the overlay stuff. Because the document itself doesn't understand change, it's very difficult to write these more advanced rules. And because it doesn't understand change, it doesn't understand all the different histories that it might have to look for with evidence. So just a simple one is when you have 2 OpenAPI documents and you're trying to compare them to one another, it's really hard to know whether a renamed field was actually renamed or if it was one field that was deleted, a new field that was added. You lose context when you're comparing these things. And when you do big API life cycles where you have open API changes from multiple people, if some person adds an endpoint and then you're doing a diff, the semantic diff will tell you that that endpoint was added. But then when someone else comes in and adds a different endpoint from a different branch, it will say that that endpoint was added and the other one was deleted because it doesn't know about the other ordering. So there's a lot of these kinds of things when you want to collaborate at scale. I'm actually really interested because in the Postman comic, it said a Git friendly version control system. So I'm very curious what that ends up being. But I think like this whole story around multiple people collaborating on the document has never really worked particularly well. And that to me is where most of the bottlenecks live alongside this history thing. And you could do it with extensions, but like how long before it's not human readable or writable anymore? And then you have this other problem of how do you get people to write down their changes? And then we're back to square one of, well, if people can't write down their changes, none of this matters. So I think that's why I'm not optimistic that it will, even if people took all these principles and tried to do it with OpenAPI, I'm not optimistic that it would work the same way.
Yeah. I mean, it just seems like with the evidence-based proposal base that you could make a proposal and provide evidence to add an address field to an instance of an API. And you could also make the evidence to add that property to the FHIR specification, a standard laying on top of it, and then also make a proposal to that being a protocol based something else that's like extends open API, that you could provide the evidence in the proposal that would go up the stack all the way and go, well, this, open API doesn't support this. We don't define this. And here's my proposal for it. Tooling providers, documentation, code gen folks could then say, what is this proposal? We're going to surface that. We're seeing that across 180 different APIs. Let's add that to our documentation tool. Let's add that to her. And then the open API is having to pedal to keep up with this because people are extending the spec. The tooling providers are adopting it. And it's not under the open API umbrella. It's the API lifecycle kind of being extended.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, we very intentionally made the optics spec underneath this super extensible. So you could potentially import the FHIR specification as part of how you use your API, and the parts that are generic will be genericized in how you implement things. But then, you can provide evidence to say, hey, of these, 10 healthcare apps, these 7 are using the latest FHIR spec with all these new ideas in it, and these 3 haven't done it yet. And evidence can also tell you kind of where people are on their own adoption life cycle of getting up to the most recent versions of all these tools. But I think there's that's all the stuff I get really excited about is like, what can you do once we've brought sanity to the current operating, sequence we're all on.
Very exciting stuff. Very compelling. I'm glad this is what we chose to go down this road. We're going to have to be continued on this. And I think you and I don't know what we got planned next week, but we're going to have to dive back into this because I want to continue this conversation. But with that said, I've got to talk to the FDA right now. They're waiting on a call for me. So,
man, I thought we were like 20 minutes in. I haven't looked at the time since we started. Dang.
So I got back-to-back meetings. So I know it went by fast, huh? It was like crazy fast. So I was not ready for it at all either. So
have fun with the FDA. I'm sure it's a good time.
Yeah, they're looking to understand how to use Open API to figure all this out. So this is actually very relevant when we said FHIR specification because it's so yeah. Anyways, this is great, man. This is exactly what I want to keep having this conversation. So we're gonna beat this. Well, if Mike allows, I want to keep figuring this out each week. If we need to take it outside of API storytelling, we can. But I want to hammer on this until we see eye to eye. And I
mean, this is all going to be real world too. So like we could even be demoing inside the tool, and you can be providing me evidence of something, and I'd be providing you evidence of something, and actually see it in real world.
That's exactly where I want to go with doing this. In Postman is I can do this in Postman and show it in real time as well as in Optic. And if we can do this dance around it, I think we can get some other folks on board as well. So
awesome.
Good stuff.
Good to see you, Ken. Catch you.
Alrighty. Have a good weekend, boss. Cheers.
You too, sir. Have fun with the FDA. Bye.
Thank you. Wow. Okay. That went by fast. Yeah. All right. Well, everyone have a good weekend, and I will see y'all next week.
It's story time. Time to start the day.